Hi everyone, welcome back to Uplifting Studios TV. I'm Annie Gishu, and today I'm joined by Elizabeth Lang, who is the founder and CEO of Diversity Focus, where she deals with diversity, equity, and inclusion, training, research, and coaching. And Elizabeth, I'm so happy to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Not a problem at all. So, we have a lot to talk about today, mainly around the power of representation. But I want us to go back a little bit and just share with us your journey as a migrant woman of color, coming to Australia and getting into the work that you do right now.
Sure. So my story really begins when we migrated in 1998. So I arrived with my family as a child, and we've lived here since. But having come, excuse me, originally from South Sudan,
Yes.
moving into Egypt, spending 4 years in Egypt, and then moving to Australia. And I guess our move was motivated, and I guess, long story short, our move from Sudan originally to Egypt was motivated by the tensions of what was happening. And growing up as a child, my father was heavily involved in the freedom movement.
Yes.
And so that sort of put us at risk. And so he moved the family to Egypt. We lived there for a couple of years. And then the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees had a refugee program.
Mhm.
Excuse me. So through the refugee program, we were accepted, and we moved from Egypt then to Australia. So that's sort of how I came to be here. And I guess growing up, and particularly as I got older, started to really appreciate human rights and social justice. And I think that was sort of strongly, I guess, I had strong roots in that through my father. And even
Mm.
in his sort of later years, he was very much an advocate. He was terminally sick, but he was an advocate for peace and for justice. He was constantly lobbying the government, even in South Sudan. And I sort of was a part of that. And I would write a lot of his letters and edit them and constantly posting things off. So I think that had a huge impact on me, and in particular on my desire, I think, to want to be a part of positive change in the world, and the desire to fight for justice and for human rights. So that was something that I think was strongly ingrained in me.
Mhm.
But definitely, I think I guess, migration experience, having lived in Egypt,
Yes.
some of the things that I experienced as a child in Egypt, being ethnically and religiously, it's got a very different makeup to a lot of African countries. So
Mhm.
we experienced a lot of racism. I personally experienced, even though I was only 10. I mean, I was 6 until I was 10 when we were there. Experienced a lot of
Yes.
racism and very sort of overt public displays of racism and hate.
Right.
So then also moving into Australia, I wasn't really immune from that, but it was perhaps a little bit more overt rather than covert racism. So
Mhm.
I think the collection of that, the migration context, my father's sort of affiliations and involvement in social justice, combined with my own sort of experiences in Australia, and the career path that I subsequently took was sort of geared towards social justice and human rights. And I think through that, I found my way into diversity, equity, inclusion, because I saw a gap in, I guess, the availability of services or companies that were rooted from a place of human rights and social justice, but also provided an alternative perspective. And that's what led me to founding Diversity Focus. So it'll be our 3rd year anniversary on Monday next week. So
Wow.
it's been
Congratulations,
an amazing
Elizabeth.
journey. Thank you.
That's a major milestone, especially, small business starting up something from scratch. That's a big deal.
No,
And
definitely.
and you're doing really meaningful work. And so tell us, getting into your career and the barriers that you've had to face. So obviously, growing up, there's been, the racial injustices that you faced and the different situations you've been placed. But now, as an adult, growing up, going to university, and really ultimately getting into your career, how have those barriers presented themselves as a migrant woman of color?
Mm. They've presented in different ways. I guess the most obvious ways, which I think a lot of women would probably connect with, is just the daily experiences of being othered by people, being made to feel
Mm,
less than, or being made to feel different, or being made to feel like you don't belong, and often not being provided with the opportunity to even have input. Those barriers will present as, sometimes the reality is there will be opportunities that are simply not given to you because somebody's decided that you don't deserve it. And not because
yeah,
you're not qualified, and not because you don't meet the whatever minimum requirements are or don't have the experience, in an employment context, for example, but simply because somebody has the power to make a decision and they've chosen to do otherwise. So that's just the reality. I think that that's a part of life. But one thing that I've come to learn, particularly over the last few years, as I've really worked on my mindset and reconditioning the way that I think, and learning and relearning and unlearning a lot of things, I've come to understood that what people choose to do is often not within the realm of our control, but what we have control over is how we react to what people choose to do.
yeah,
And so I've always seen those barriers rather than sort of allowing myself and I'm sure I've been held back many times, but I've sort of used them to propel me forward rather than hold me back.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and it's sad that sometimes you have to work harder than everybody else just to prove. But that's what it's meant for me in many circumstances, and I continue to do that. I mean, it's 2020, but things haven't changed. I mean, things have changed, but there's still a lot of that kind of thing happening where people are
yeah,
being excluded. So one thing that I've just consistently done is I've said I have control over how I think and how I behave.
mhm,
And
mhm,
even though it's not my fault necessarily, it's my responsibility how I deal with when somebody chooses to be racist or when somebody chooses to deny me an opportunity. It's not my fault, but it's my responsibility because I have to find a way to deal with it. And I could either
yeah,
sink in and go, this world is horrible, everybody's racist, I'm just going to sit at home and do nothing. I could do that, but then I'd be
yeah,
robbing myself of opportunities. But I would also, I think, be robbing the world of what I believe I was placed in the world to do. So then I see it as ultimately a responsibility to go, that's their problem and they need to
mm,
deal with it, but I have to do what I have to do to move me forward. So I guess
absolutely.
I
I
focus
couldn't,
more on, yeah, what to do
yeah.
rather.
And that's the positive way to look at it, because I think if you sit down and look at the uneven playing ground, you will not move
Mm,
forward. You will be like,
yeah,
this is stacked against me. Why even make, any move or try and do anything, make any progress? It's against
exactly.
us. I
Mm,
like what you wrote on LinkedIn. You put up a post a couple of weeks ago, which was following the march that happened
mm,
in Perth, the Black Lives Matter march, and you were speaking there. One of the things that struck me that you said that I think a lot of people will resonate with is the fact that there is a shift. We are beginning to see a
mm,
shift in this conversation about Black Lives Matter. We're beginning to see a shift in the racial injustice awareness. Can you
yeah.
just share a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So I was involved in the Black Lives Matter in Perth. So I went to a few of the planning meetings. I sort of got involved just through, I think it was somebody who told me about the meeting, and I attended because I felt that it was important. And from there, I was sort of asked to be a part of the panel of speakers to speak on the day to represent the African community in WA, of
Mhm.
which I am the vice president for operations. So Joe Tuzama, who's the president, requested if I could speak on behalf of the organization, which I was happy to do. I
Great.
guess partly because of my role in OAC, but also because of I have a I guess career wise, it's sort of within my realm, the advocacy stuff that I do, as well as the work on
Mm-hmm.
human rights and equity and inclusion. So initially, it sort of started with a position statement that OAC presented, and it was publicly shared, just saying that we condemn the injustice of racism, we condemn what's happened in the US, and we also recognize that it's very much alive in Australia, and that we stand in solidarity with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who
Mm-hmm.
experience the brunt of, I guess, racial oppression when you look at the rates of incarceration, of deaths in custody, etc. So my speech at the rally or at the protest, it was really, I guess, it was a platform to be able to speak as a Black African woman,
Yes.
um, as somebody who's not far removed from what we're talking about as well, but also speaking on
Mm-hmm.
behalf of the OAC and WA. And I guess it was an amazing moment, I think, in my journey, because there must have been some 15,000 people,
Yeah.
and the audience expands. It extended beyond my eyesight. I actually couldn't see where it ended, um, but it
Wow.
was it was a very powerful moment for me, because I really felt encouraged when I looked at the sea of faces. I saw people of all backgrounds, of all races, of all, I saw men, women, there were children there. It was just really, it moved it from a black and white issue to a
Yeah.
human rights issue. And I think that ultimately that's what, when we talk about racial injustice and oppression and violence, that's what it's about. It's about human
Mm-hmm.
rights, because the reality is, as Black people, we're human beings. And
Absolutely.
we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by virtue of the fact that we're human, not for any other reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so to see people represented from all walks of life coming to that, taking a stand and saying, we know what's going on and we're not happy with it, and we believe that things need to change for the better. For me, it
Mm-hmm.
gave me huge encouragement. And I think when I was sort of reflecting afterwards, I realized that in my career, and I guess even beyond my career, because I also do research. So, before I got into the field, I guess I do a lot of research in terms of what's the developments and what has changed over time,
Yeah.
etc. But I think even in the grand scheme of things beyond my career, I think, and I've heard a lot of people share similar sentiments. It sort of I guess, confirmed to me that it wasn't my own belief as well, only. But I think the first time really where I've seen a significant shift in the psyche of the masses, where people are in huge numbers saying that we are aware that this is happening and we
Mm-hmm.
are not happy with what's going on. And we don't want to sit back anymore and just say, it's not my problem because I'm not impacted
Yeah.
by whatever they're talking about. More people are taking a stand and saying this is a human rights issue and it requires all of us to speak up and to change it. And if I have the privilege to be shocked by the stories of racism against Black people or anyone really, I have to use that privilege in a way that propels social change rather than just sitting back and saying it's not my problem. And so I think that's why
Mm-hmm.
it was a huge encouragement to me. And it's interesting because even in my line of work, we sort of went from like within a couple of weeks, we'd be doing up flyers for, say, events or redoing the website. And we have to
Mm-hmm.
be very mindful of the wording that we use, because the America is very different to Australia.
Yes.
I have one staff member who's from the US,
Mm-hmm.
and she does amazing work for me. And she was talking about, I was telling her about how in Australia, the majority of diversity and inclusion companies are headed by predominantly white Australians. And the
Yeah.
majority of staff are also white Australians. And for her, that was a huge shock, because she said, in the US, it's very different. It doesn't make sense that you would
Mm-hmm.
claim to be a diversity and equity and inclusion training company and only have white staff. Like, how can you then try and teach organizations how to diversify if that's not reflected in your organization? So she took
Yeah.
it upon herself to do some research, and she realized that what I was saying was true. She gave me a list of 20 or 30 national companies. She said, Liz, I was so shocked by that statement you made last week. This is what I did over the weekend. And she sent me the list. She said,
Wow.
these are all the companies. And she actually listed what diversity they had. So she was like, I think
Hmm.
maybe out of the 20 or 30, maybe 2 or 3 of them had someone of color, but it was just one staff member. All of them
Yeah.
were headed by generally people of sort of Anglo-Saxon background. So for her, that was a huge shock. But I think, when we talk about this issue of diversity and inclusion, it's such a big issue. And sometimes people think, oh, it's just a bunch of people complaining because they don't
Mhm.
appreciate or whatever. People don't understand how much of an impact it has. So I think just back to the Black Lives Matter conversation,
Yeah.
I've felt really encouraged, and I think that the change has been global because we've seen people in. I mean, I've seen images of people in Syria do vigils for George Floyd, and there was paintings of him in
Wow.
Germany, and I've seen, various Middle Eastern countries, and countries that I didn't necessarily expect to be, standing
Yes.
up, but it had such an impact on people because I think even though people have always known that racism exists, I think you
Mm,
can't unsee what you see with George Floyd's death. And it's made people
absolutely.
realize to go, this is what people have been talking about. We've just never seen it so publicly, but this is
Hmm.
what's been happening behind closed doors for hundreds of years. This is how people are brutally killed and murdered for no other reason than the fact that they're Black,
Yeah.
whether it's through the justice system or through what's going on with the police in the United States. So I think his George Floyd's death being such a graphic illustration of hate crime and violence motivated by racial hate, I think it's made people go, this is a bigger problem than what we think it is, and it's time that we speak up and make a change.
Yeah.
um, and I'm really hopeful and that change will be lasting. But
Yeah.
it's interesting because even like I was saying earlier, in within a couple of weeks of what happened with Floyd, even the language around that we use within the space has really changed.
It
It had
has.
to be, it has. In Australia, historically, when you talk about race or racism, it's seen as very much, it's a very uncomfortable and awkward conversation. And people, and even the
Yes.
word race and racism, I mention it in a workshop and people start freezing. People like to talk about
Mm,
culture, but they don't want to
yeah.
talk about race. But
Culture,
now,
ethnicity.
or ethnicity, or or language, or whatever people
Yeah.
find is a much more gentle sort of term. But
Yeah.
now, you mentioned the word race. You talk about racial oppression. You
Mm,
even talk about privilege. People used to get upset and offended, like, I work
mm,
hard to get here. What do you mean I'm privileged? And I guess people not
mm,
understanding what that actually means. It's, yes, you do work hard, but you started off in a very different position to the person of color who's had to work 10 times harder to
yeah.
get half of the recognition that you've
Mm,
gotten, half of the work that you've done. So
mm,
there's been a
mm,
huge shift, and I think I've seen the language has changed as well.
yeah.
A couple of months ago, we probably wouldn't do a workshop, a public one, and we might call it, conversations about whatever, like, it would be something different. But now it's conversations about race, privilege, and power. And I think
Wow.
that people are actually hungry for that, and they're saying, we need spaces to talk about these things. I don't even understand what this all means. I'm trying to understand. uh,
Mm,
and that's what we're hoping to do with some more, I guess, public forums around race, privilege, and oppression in the next couple of weeks. So
and I guess, yes, language has really changed. I mean, you and I having this conversation would not have happened a month ago. It would
mm,
have been a no-go zone. What are you talking
yeah,
about? A
yeah,
very uncomfortable conversation to have, even for you and I publicly, for you and I, maybe behind closed
mm,
doors, in a safe space where you and I are
yeah,
comfortable. Yes, those conversations have always happened, but to put it out in the public forum like this and call it what it is
mm,
definitely things have changed in that regard. And I think also something notable during this whole protests and the movement has been the fact that it's been in the middle of a pandemic,
mm,
and people have come out. They've come
Yeah,
out in huge, large numbers, and I think that in itself speaks volumes.
it does. It
Hmm.
does, because it's another pandemic. It just hasn't been recognized for a long time. That's the reality.
Wow, that is so true. It's another pandemic. I haven't heard it referred
Mm,
to as that, but it is true. It's another
mm,
pandemic.
mm,
Now, I want us to shift gears ever so slightly and get into the power of representation, because now I believe as people of color and particularly Black people begin to share their stories, or
mm.
other people, non-Black people, begin to hear of the difficulties, the barriers, the challenges that have been faced.
Yep.
We are beginning to also see issues with representation, the fact that it's not there. And let's talk about Australia, because this is home for us,
Mm,
for you and I,
yep.
which also brings to mind a post that I saw up where somebody was saying that with all this that's been happening, with the whole, George Floyd murder and the
Mm,
reports in the news from an Australian perspective, it's all
yep.
been coming from, white people, white reporters, throwing
Yep.
back to white reporters. And like there has, and a screenshot was put there of the different, television stations and the people, who are reporting. And there was just no diversity at all in
Mm,
terms of from a color perspective. And so I'd like us to talk a little bit more about the power of representation.
mm. I think, excuse me, representation is it's critical, because I guess particularly in the context of Australia, because Australia likes to pride itself as a
Mm,
multicultural country. Its pride and joy is that it has representation of people from all about, and that's great. And that's great. I guess in terms of promoting Australia, or giving Australia that image.
mhm,
But I think the responsibility to ensure that there is adequate representation of the so-called multiculturalism that you're so proud of is hugely lacking in Australia. So I think, and I was reading recently an article that was talking about the issue of lack of representation across sort of the major sectors, so tertiary sector, the public sector, etc. And it's interesting because people have always known there's a lack, and people have always
mhm,
known that representation is important, but there hasn't been, I think, enough commitment made to actually address the barriers that are in place that lead to a lack of representation on the first place. Because I think it's easy to then assume, if there's no diversity, it's easy to assume that, well, maybe you don't have a lot of people, say, in the tertiary education sector, because maybe there's not many lecturers that are qualified enough to be, or professors or what have you, that are qualified enough to hold those positions. But it's
yeah,
actually, it's, if you take that even many steps back, it's not that there isn't necessarily a lack. Even when you have people that are well qualified for roles, it's
mhm,
the, I guess, again, it's the uneven playing field. Because if you judge resumes, um, if you have different measures of success for different people, then you're naturally going to get results that are very different. If you naturally, and I'm talking more like HR and hiring practices, if your hiring practices are such that you have people that have, because we all have biases, but people have their own unconscious biases. They don't even know they have them. But they see a foreign last name, first and last name, but they see John
mhm,
Smith or whatever. John Smith
mhm,
doesn't not have as much qualifications as a person with a foreign last name. But the
mhm,
unconscious bias that that person says to them, that this person is white, they know what they're doing more. This person is likely a migrant, they don't understand the system. That's very, very unconscious, because consciously that person is not thinking that way. And even if
yes.
you tell them those words, they would be mortified, because they would think, oh my God, that's not me. I don't. look at people like that. I don't see color. I hear that all the time. I don't see color. People have their, but the reality is people have biases and that influences the decisions they make. So that sort of filters down to a lack of representation because it starts even in within the playground at school. It's a child who is looked at in
Mm.
a particular way by the teacher. It's a child who's um, not provided with as much support as other children. It's a child who feels like they don't even exist in the classroom.
Yeah.
That's where it begins. That child grows up, continues to navigate a society that continues to tell them in every possible way through, mass media, through television, through lack of, books that are, diverse, through lack of toys, And I know this because being a mom, I've got two young children.
Yeah.
I have to work harder to get books that show representation to my children, and it's usually buying stuff
Yeah.
online.
Yes, I hear
Toys,
you.
yeah, and toys have gotten better now, but a couple of years ago there was no toy that was brown or even dark skinned. It was all just white, dolls or whatever. And it's easy for someone to go, well, Australia's, a white country. Well, no, that's not true. Australia is a black country before it became colonized. That's number one. Number
Mm.
two, Australia
Mm.
is always talking about being multicultural and it's proud of its diversity, etc. So I think if you're going to make those claims, it gives you a responsibility to ensure you uphold those claims by ensuring that you provide representation, an opportunity, and a voice for people. And I think it's not even about the way that I think of it is it's not about say white people saying to non-white people, here is the opportunity. That's not what I'm asking for.
Yeah.
It sort of it goes way beyond that. When you've set up a system that serves the majority or serves one monoculture group, that's
Mm.
going to benefit that monoculture group. So people are not asking for things that they didn't work for. People just asking for the criteria that are set in place or the playing field to be made even, such that when I show up, I could be equally judged as a white woman my age, rather than me being judged as maybe I'm less than qualified for no reason, you
Mm.
know. And that's what it's really about. Because I think it's easy for people to get that twisted and go, well, we can't just give things to people. Nobody's asking for any handout. People are simply asking for equity when opportunities present, that you're judged equitably and that
Yeah.
you get the opportunity fair and square, but you are not judged with a different lens than the other candidate. And that's what people are really after. But I think it's an
Mm.
all-encompassing issue, and it's something that I see, through the workforce, but also through even schooling, education,
Mm.
and
It's
it has a huge
entrenched in our
impact.
different institutions. It
It's
really is
deeply
entrenched.
entrenched.
And so, how do we begin to is it even possible, Elizabeth, to begin to have institutions where there is that fairness that comes
Mm,
to play? Because unconscious bias, we have it, we don't even know we have it. That's why it's called unconscious. Uh,
mm,
will we get to a place where perhaps your children and my children even will have it a little bit easier, a little bit fairer when it comes to opportunities?
mm. As an optimist, I would say yes, we can get there, but it's not going to be easy. I think we are getting there. I think there's been some important shifts that have happened positively, and I think they will continue to happen. But I think it rests on people of color actively being a part of the change, and
Mhm.
people that are not, you know, people that like allies that see the importance of the cause also being a part of the conversation. I think that
Yeah.
that's how we lead to change. But I think it's also about thinking that as women of color or people of color, if, even if you're a man, for example, if you're in a position where you have some influence to influence things for the better, you have to think
Yes.
beyond yourself in that position. You have to think, how am I paving a way for the people that will come after me? So I think it's a responsibility that rests on
Mm.
all of us in our various fields of endeavor or whatever it is that we do in our various different careers. We might have opportunities to mentor a younger person who's
Yes.
sort of working through their career. It's about doing that. We have opportunities. We have children in our influence, whether it's our own children or relatives. It's about
Mm,
being that voice of encouragement to a child who continues to be overlooked at school and feels like they don't even exist. It's about being able to see that person and speak life into them. Or
mm,
somebody tells you of their dreams. How do you respond? Do you say, oh, that's not realistic? Or do you say, wow, that's
mm.
amazing. I would love to see you achieve that.
Yeah.
What are your plans? How do you think you'll get there? And I think
Mhm,
being a voice to encourage people and to speak possibility is very important, because I think there's too many naysayers around.
mm,
Sometimes we have our
mm,
dreams and we tell them to people that don't see the possibility of them, and rather than
mm,
encourage us, we walk away feeling like maybe I just need to forget about it altogether. I think it's such a
mm,
huge issue, and people need to think of it in terms of, how do we communicate with each other? Do I put doubts into a child who says they want to be an astronaut? Or do
mm,
I commend them for having such a beautiful dream and talk to them about its possibility, and
mm.
all the things that they could possibly do with that career pathway, or what have you? So I think it's
Absolutely.
possible, but I think it requires daily conversation and people actively working towards creating a change, because it's not just going to happen, and it's definitely not just going to be handed over to people.
Yeah, I love that you've said speak to the possibilities
Mm,
inside of somebody. Speak to that. That is such a powerful statement. And it is, we need more of that. We need so much more of that. And as we wind up, Elizabeth, perhaps you could give us some simple tools or some simple steps of how can we begin to, harness some more of representation in our workplaces, because we know that within the community looks a certain way, but in the
mm,
workplace, it looks really, really different. What
mm,
can we do to harness that look? We say we are multicultural, right? As
mm,
an Australian nation, but how can we begin to see that represented in our workplaces where you and I can stop saying, I'm the only person of
mm,
color, or I'm the only black person in my
mm,
organization, or maybe we are two or three. What steps can organizations, workplaces begin to take to, begin to harness this representation, and not do it from a place of tokenism, because there is the idea of diversity heaven, and as Fadzi one day puts it, inclusion, hell. How can we have it in
mm.
such a way? Yes, it's diverse, but it's inclusive as well.
Exactly. I think I would take a step back a little bit in saying
Sure.
that it's important for us that as individuals that we work on ourselves. Because I think if we have certain ideas that are limiting, that is going to hold us back, and that's going to hold us back from having any kind of meaningful change within the workplace. And I really believe that any kind of positive change that we wish to starts with us first making an internal change.
Yes.
So I think as a first step, it would be being aware of who you are as a person, where you come from, your roots, all that kind of stuff. But more importantly, the way that you think. What is the pattern of your thinking? Do you have certain limiting beliefs, or have you been conditioned to see the world in a certain way or think in a certain way that doesn't really serve you and doesn't serve your community? That's one aspect of it. And if you recognize that you sort of have, I guess, limiting beliefs or doubt, you have doubts about yourself, or you inherently think that you're not capable, or you think you're not as good as other people within the workplace or what have you, that's going to really have a huge influence on how much work you can meaningfully um, create within the workplace. And if you recognize that you have that, and there's an internal change that needs to happen, it's about firstly addressing that. You might have to unlearn some things that you've learned over time. You might have to
Mm-hmm.
relearn new things. And a huge part of that is being aware of what you consume. Because if you're constantly consuming content, whether that's the company that you keep, or whether that's the news that you look at, or whether that's whatever you consume on a daily basis, has a huge impact on who you are and your mental conditioning. So I think you firstly have to address that, unlearn, or recondition your thinking, I guess, by consuming new content that is affirming, that is encouraging, that helps you appreciate who you are, that helps you come to understand that as an individual, you were created unique and you have a unique
Mm,
pathway and you have a purpose for which you have been brought forth into the world. That's my firm belief. And that you have your own sort of assignment in the world. That's
yeah.
really where it begins. Because I think when that is your starting point, you are able to have bold conversations with people that say, I don't agree with us doing X, Y, and Z. I think a better way could be this. But if you
Mm,
lack that self confidence, you wouldn't even
mm,
see yourself as being deserving of whatever it is, or you wouldn't see yourself as being capable of speaking up, or you would automatically think to yourself, no one would listen to me because I'm black. You've
yeah.
already defeated yourself before you started. So I think it really starts with addressing the internal stuff, because internally, once we've addressed that, then externally we can make a change. There's a beautiful
Mm,
African proverb that I always think of that really encourages me of this, and it is, um, if there's no enemy within, the enemy outside can do us no harm. That's a
mm,
beautiful proverb that I reflect on all the time, because what that tells me constantly is I have to do the deeper work first. Because once I win in here and in here, then I
yes.
win in my environment. And I can't make meaningful change around me if I'm already starting from a position of defeat. So I think that's where
Yes.
it begins. And then in terms of to your question about making change within the workplace, I think once you're
Mm,
coming from that position, you can have very assertive conversations with people. You can look your boss in the eye and say, this is what I think. This is my
mm,
opinion. This is my suggestion. And when you are in the space where you're able to freely contribute and give ideas or even challenge and tell people, I don't think this is working, and giving them
mm-hmm.
evidence of why you don't think it's working or examples, then you're more likely to make a meaningful change, because then the manager or the boss or whoever is able to go, you know, Annie's right. She's told me this, she doesn't think this doesn't work. And she's given me an example of, or several examples of why it hasn't worked. And maybe there's more work to be done here. But if you've
Mm,
already come across, even if you've come from a position of defeat and you're trying to have that conversation, you're not going to do it in a way that's convincing. You might do it in a way that says you're not even sure of whether it needs to happen or not. And that has a huge
yeah.
impact on the change that we can create. So I think being able to speak up is really important when we see things that we don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think allowing yourself to be led, because we all have a moral compass, right? We all have that thing on the inside of us when we see something wrong. I mean, even children have it.
Yes.
My 4-year-old, if something happens, her brother does something, it's not fair. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It's that
Yeah.
inherent, that knowing that this is
Absolutely.
unjust.
Yeah.
We all
Yeah.
have that. And we all see things in our environment, even as adults in the workplace. We see things that we
Mm-hmm.
know are wrong, but we hold back. I think it's about being able to trust yourself, because I think we have that internal voice that makes us uncomfortable around certain things for a reason. And when I
Yeah.
see something that I don't think is right, it might not affect me personally, but it might affect a colleague. I have
Yeah.
to be able to speak up and say, I don't think this is right, or I don't think this is fair. I think we can do it better by doing it this way. So I think speaking up is one way. I think also getting actively involved, possibly, and I guess it would depend, because workplaces are so diverse even in their makeup, because if you work in the healthcare industry, it's very different to someone who works in the education space, for
That
example.
is so
So
true. Yeah.
it's things are going to present differently, but I guess whenever you see things that you don't agree with, it's about speaking up. It's about, if there's some active work being done within the space, you might be in a position to there might be a collective or a group of people that are doing something about it. You could perhaps join other efforts to further change. You could write letters, you could write articles, you could share your experiences on social media with friends, because we might also
Mm,
have friends, like white friends, or friends from different cultures. And when we share our stories, people, like, I remember I shared something uh, on Facebook, and I put it into an article on LinkedIn, and a lot of people reached out to me. They said, I'm really sorry to read that that's what you've gone through. I honestly never thought that things like this still happen today. So I think it's about
Yeah.
recognizing, and I know it's tiring because you feel like, how long am I going to keep talking?
Yeah.
But the reality is there's a lot of people around us, even, our friends of different cultures that just don't realize that our lives are so different. We do similar work, but
Mm,
we have very different daily experiences of life. I think being open to contributing to people and doing a bit of awareness raising with our friends, talking about things that have happened, I think creates a shift because it helps people
yeah.
realize when you then start speaking up for what is right and for change, people have a context because they go, yeah, of course, this needs to change
Yeah.
because that's not fair because this is the impact on your life. I know because Annie's told me her
Absolutely.
experiences. So I think it is
Yeah.
tiring work. I acknowledge that it's very tiring work, but I think it's necessary because what is
It
the
is.
alternative? The
It
alternative is
is.
do nothing, and it's worse for our children and our children's children. And for me, I'd rather the burden of making a change and being a catalyst for change in the faith that things will improve, so that in
Mm,
30, 50, 60 years from now, I can sit back and go, I've done my work. And yes, there's more work to be done still,
but
but
you've
I've
done your bit.
created something that has furthered the cause. And I think that
Oh,
that's a responsibility that we all have.
absolutely. And I think we will leave it there for today, Elizabeth. But tell us, what are you currently working on at the moment, and how can people get in touch with you? There's a lot of coaching and training happening in your space with organizations. How can people get in touch with you?
Sure. So I guess the easiest way is through the website.
Yes,
So www.diversityfocus.com.au. Diversityfocus.com also comes back to the same website. And
beautiful.
I'll provide the links to Annie as well so she can put them in the
Sure.
notes. So the website is the easiest way. You can contact us through the contact form on the website. Our
Yes,
direct contact details are also on the website, our phone number and email.
yes,
And I guess we've also got a YouTube channel that's relatively new. So it's got a few
fantastic.
different videos on there about topics of diversity and inclusion. So it's called Diversity Dialogues. So that's
Mhm.
something that people could connect with. There's also links on the website to the YouTube, some of the YouTube videos. And we also have
Okay.
a Facebook page. So
Yes.
if you Google diversity focus consulting, it will come up. And we would really love
Excellent.
more likes. So if you're able to give us a thumbs up,
So
we'd
get
love
on
it.
there and follow and like the work that you're doing, because your work is is changing lives, and it is necessary work. It is not easy work, but it is necessary work. So thank you very much. And Elizabeth, you touched on self-limiting beliefs. And this is where I just want to encourage you watching. If you are struggling with self-limiting beliefs, I have a free audio guide. It is 3 steps to unshackle your self-limiting beliefs. Head over to upliftingstudios.com.au and download that audio guide. It's about 20 minutes. 3 very simple steps, but they will set you on a path of clarity and just help you loosen that grip of self-limiting beliefs that I believe we all in some way or other encounter, but it's how we're able to navigate knowing that they're not dictating to us, the direction in which we go or the things that we do. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you. It's been a passionate talk, it's been a real talk. And thank you for going there with us. Thank you for everything that you shared, your experiences, and the work, the difference that you're making through Diversity Focus. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.